They say the cries could be heard for miles. Some are of 1,462nd. You are an Ottoman soldier and one of the most formidable armies ever known. You've already conquered Constantinople. You've torn down empires. Now, you march into a small principality called Wallachia to crush a rebellious prince. This should take days, maybe weeks. But then you smell it. Death, decay, something you can't quite identify. Your unit slows down. The scouts ahead have stopped. As you round the bend near the capital, you see it. A forest. But the trees, they aren't trees at all. They're people. 20,000 of them. Your fellow soldiers, your comrades placed on wooden stakes, arranged in perfect rows, stretching as far as the eye can see. Some of them have been dead for weeks, their bodies bloated and blackened. Others are still alive, still breathing, still screaming. Your sultan, the very man who brought down the Byzantine Empire, looks at the scene and orders his entire army to turn back. What kind of person does this? And here's the chilling part: this was the act of madness. It was strategy. Cold, calculated, and horrificously effective. The version of the story you've heard about Vlad the Impaler, it's not a lie, but it's far less horrific than the truth. What he did was so much worse than anything you've ever been told. This is the complete story of how one man turned human suffering into a weapon so effective that it changed the course of history. By the end of this, you'll see that the real terror wasn't what he did to bodies. It was what he did to bodies, it was what he did to minds. Let's start with a question no one seems to ask: what breaks a person so completely that they become capable of such atrocities? The year is 1442nd. Vlad is 11 years old. His father, Vlad I, known as Vlad the Dragon, has just made a deal with the devil. Not a metaphorical devil, but a real one: Sultan Mehmed II of the Ottoman Empire. The agreement is simple. Vlad I keeps his throne in Wallachia, but in return he gives up his two youngest sons as hostages, ensuring his loyalty. So, young Vlad and his brother Radu are taken from their home and delivered into the heart of the Ottoman Empire. They aren't thrown into prison dungeons, they are treated as guests in the grand palaces of Agony and later, Adrianople. They are given fine clothes, an education, and military training. They are taught Turkish, Arabic, philosophy, and the Quran. On the surface, it seems like a privileged life. But here's the part the history books often leave out. This wasn't an education, it was psychological warfare. Vlad spent his formative years, from ages 11 to 17, watching his captors perfect the art of empire building. He saw how the Ottomans wielded fear as a tool to rule. He watched public executions, not just to punish, but to terrorize entire populations into submission. He learned that terror, used with precision, could be more effective than any army. But he also learned something else. He was utterly powerless. While his younger brother Radu adjusted, even befriended Sultan Mehmed's son Vlad resisted. Court records tell us he was oft unpunished for his defiance. Some say he was beaten, even tortured. The full details are lost to time. But one thing is certain: something inside him broke. Or maybe more accurately, something took shape. Vlad developed what modern psychologists describe as a persecution complex. Combined with a deep, obsessive need for control, he channeled it. Every punishment he suffered, every torture he witnessed, became fuel for something darker. By the time he returned to Wallachia in 1448, after 6 years of captivity, Vlad was a different person. 2 months later, his father was assassinated by rival boyars, the nobility who played both sides against the Ottomans and the Hungarians. His older brother Mircea was buried alive. Vlad was left alone, surrounded by enemies with no allies. But this is where things get interesting. He didn't just want revenge. He wanted to remake the world in the image of his pain. Everything he had learned from the Ottomans, all their methods of terror, would now be twisted into something far worse. But before he could begin, he had to wait. For 6 years, Vlad lived in exile, studying military strategy, politics, and waiting for his moment. Then in 1456, with Hungarian support, he took the Wallachia and throne. This was the birth of the monster. If you're interested in how broken people often become the most infamous figures in history, hit subscribe. We're just getting started in understanding how this tortured boy became something far worse than his captors ever imagined. Vlad's coronation feast in 1456 should have been a grand celebration, but instead it became the blueprint for the horrors that followed. He invited the boyar families, those very same nobles who had orchestrated his father's death and buried his brother alive. Hundreds of them arrived, dressed in their finest attire, expecting to pledge their loyalty to the new prince. The grand hall was decorated, and wine flowed freely. Then, in the middle of the feast, Vlad stood up and asked the simple question, "How many princes of Wallachia have you survived?" The older boyar proudly boasted 710. Some claimed to have witnessed more than a dozen different rulers. They were bragging about their survival skills, their political maneuvering, their ability to outlast anyone who ruled. Vlad smiled. Then, he gave the order. Every boyar who had answered was arrested. But here's where his true cunning emerged. He didn't kill them right away. Instead, he divided them into two groups, based on their age and health. The older ones, those who had masterminded the downfall of his family, were impaled immediately. Not swiftly but deliberately, with stakes carefully placed to avoid eating vital organs, ensuring they would die slowly, agonizingly, over the course of hours or even days. Their screams echoed through the air. Meanwhile, the younger and stronger boyars, along with their families, were stripped of their fine clothes and forced to march 50 miles north to the ruins of Polnary Castle. There they faced a choice that wasn't really a choice at all: rebuild the fortress with their bare hands or die. For months they labored under brutal conditions. They hauled heavy stones up the mountainside, their hands bleeding, their fine clothing rotting off their bodies collapsing from exhaustion. Most of them died during the construction. Those who survived were forever changed. With this, Vlad had successfully dismantled the old nobility and replaced it with a new class of people who owed everything to him and feared his wrath. But this wasn't just about revenge. It was a calculated attempt to eliminate any remaining power structures in Wallachia. Vlad wanted complete control. Not just loyalty, but absolute obedience. He wanted people so broken that they had no choice but to serve him. But that was just the beginning. What happened next would send shockwaves through entire empires. In 1459, Sultan Mehmed II, the same Mehmed who had once been Vlad's childhood friend, sent envoys to Wallachia. They were there to demand the tribute that Vlad's father had agreed to pay. Along with an added insult, Vlad himself was to present himself in Constantinople to renew his oath of vassalage. The envoys arrived expecting the usual political games and negotiation, a counter-offer perhaps. What they received was something far worse. When they entered Vlad's court and refused to remove their turbans, a religious custom of the Ottomans, Vlad asked them to explain their tradition. They did so, probably relieved, but he seemed interested in their customs. Vlad nodded thoughtfully, and then said something that must have chilled them to the core. "I respect a man who honors his faith so completely. Let me help you honor it forever." He ordered his guns to nail the turbans directly to the envoys' skulls. Imagine the cruelty in that moment. He didn't kill them, but he mutilated them in a way that was not only symbolic but medically calculated to ensure they would survive long enough to make the journey back to Constantinople. They would return to the Sultan walking, their screams carrying the message of Vlad's power and madness. When Mehmed received his envoys, their skulls pierced by nails, he realized something that shook him to his core. This was no longer the boy he had known. This was someone far more dangerous. Someone who had taken Ottoman methods of terror and pushed them to unimaginable extremes. War then became inevitable. But before it came, Vlad had more messages to send. Most people don't understand impalement. It was just about execution. It was a calculated act of terror, an engineering feat. The common image of a stake driven straight through a person's body would kill almost instantly. But that wasn't Vlad's goal. His method was far more cruel, sophisticated, and intended to maximize psychological impact. The victim would be laid face down. The stake, carefully chosen, rounded at the tip, and lubricated, would be inserted through the rectum. The key part of this process was the angle at which the stake was inserted, designed specifically to avoid major organs and blood vessels. The victim would then be slowly raised upright, and gravity would do the rest. For over hours, sometimes days, the body weight would force the stake higher and higher, often emerging through the chest or shoulder. The process was agonizing, and victims could remain alive for days. Why this method? Because Vlad understood something that modern psychological warfare experts now confirm: prolonged suffering is far more traumatic than a quick death. A beheading on the battlefield is terrible, but brief. Impalement, on the other hand, was a performance that lasted for hours, even days, with the victim's screams filling the air. But the act itself was only part of the equation. The real genius was in how it was staged. Vlad often impaled his victims in public squares, on major roads, and outside city gates, where the maximum number of people would see. He knew that rumors and word of mouth would spread the psychological effect far beyond the actual number of people who saw it. One impalement witnessed by 100 people would become 100 storytellers, each telling 100 more. Vlad also used symbolism. The height of the stake corresponded to the victim's rank. Peasants were impaled near the ground, while nobles were higher up. The highest stakes were reserved for enemy commanders. This created a visual hierarchy, reinforcing his control over every aspect of society. In some cases, Vlad arranged the impaled bodies in geometric shapes, circles, stars, and concentric rings. This wasn't mindless sadism, it was a deliberate demonstration of his power. There is a German pamphlet from 1462. A piece of propaganda. Yes. But one based on eyewitness accounts from Saxon merchants who had witnessed the terror firsthand in Wallachia. The pamphlet describes Vlad dining amidst the impaled bodies. He allegedly set up a table in the middle of a field of stakes and ate his meals surrounded by the dying. He seemed to take pleasure in it. Whether this particular incident happened exactly as described is debated, but there is no doubt about the psychological message it conveyed. Vlad was so far beyond the bounds of normal human behavior that the horror of his actions no longer affected him. The Saxons, who had a complicated relationship with Vlad, circulated these pamphlets far and wide. They were among the first mass-produced horror stories in Europe, complete with woodcut illustrations. These crude but powerful images spread across the continent, cementing Vlad's reputation. But here's the question no one was asking: was any of this working? Was terror truly an effective military strategy, or was Vlad simply a sadist who enjoyed torturing others? The answer came in the summer of 1462. It would prove that Vlad's methods weren't just effective, they were devastatingly so. Sultan Mehmed II, the same sultan who had conquered Constantinople at the age of 21, the same sultan who had crushed rebellion after rebellion and commanded the most powerful military in the world, finally decided he had enough. By early 1462, Vlad had not only refused to pay the tribute owed to the Ottomans, but had also launched trades deep into Ottoman territory south of the Danube. In one particularly brutal campaign, he crossed into Ottoman lands with a small force and, according to his own letters to the Hungarian king, killed over 23,000 people. He even kept a body count, categorizing the victims by age and gender. The Ned, enraged by this, resolved to personally handle the Wallachia problem. In the spring of 1462, Sultan Mehmed assembled an army estimated to be between 60,000 and 90,000 men numbers, so vast they far exceeded Wallachia's entire military strength. This wasn't an invasion, it was an extermination. Vlad could only muster 20,000 to 30,000 men, many of them peasant conscripts with little training. A conventional battle would have been a slaughter. So Vlad did what he had been planning since childhood: he refused to give them a traditional battle. As the Ottoman army marched into Wallachia, they found nothing. Empty villages, poisoned wells, burned fields. Every source of food and water had been systematically destroyed. Vlad had ordered his people to abandon their homes and retreat into the forests and mountains, taking their livestock with them. The Ottoman supply lines grew longer and longer, and then came the night raids. These were typical skirmishes. Vlad had trained specialized units in guerrilla warfare. Small groups of men, sometimes no more than 50 to 100, would strike Ottoman camps under the cover of darkness. They would kill sentries, set fires, and then vanish before any organized response could be mounted. They targeted supply wagons, pack animals, and ammunition stores. The goal was to defeat the Ottoman army, it was to wear them down, to make them paranoid, exhausted, and demoralized. But the masterpiece came on the night of June 17th. 1462. Vlad had learned from captured Ottoman soldiers that Sultan Mehmed himself was camped near Turbo-Vist with his elite Janissary Guard. This was the opportunity of a lifetime. Vlad personally led a force of about 10,000 men in what would become known as the night attack. Under the cover of darkness, they infiltrated the massive Ottoman camp with one objective: to kill the Sultan. Contemporary accounts describe the chaos that ensued. Vlad's men, dressed in captured Ottoman uniforms and speaking enough Turkish to sow confusion, set fire to tents, stampeded horses, and specifically targeted the section of the camp where Mehmed's pavilion stood. They came within yards of the Sultan. Some historians believe that Vlad and Mehmed even locked eyes across the flaming chaos. However, the Janissaries held their ground, forming a protective circle around their leader. After hours of fierce combat, Vlad realized he could not break through. He ordered a retreat, and his men vanished into the night as swiftly as they had come. The Ottoman casualties were relatively light, perhaps around 2,000, though Ottoman sources downplay the numbers. The real damage, however, was psychological. The Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, surrounded by his elite forces, had nearly been killed by a vastly outnumbered enemy that struck without warning and vanished like ghosts. Mehmed's commanders were shaken. His soldiers were exhausted, and they still had weeks of marching to do before reaching Constantinople. As they continued their march, they encountered a sight that would break even the most hardened soldiers. Imagine being an Ottoman soldier. You've been marching for weeks through barren, scorched earth. You're starving, fatigued, and on edge from constant night raids. You haven't seen the enemy in days. That should be a sign of relief, but instead, it feels like a trap. As you approach the Wallachia capital, the smell hits you first, the overpowering stench of decay. It's so thick you can taste it in the air. Then, as you look ahead, you see the stakes. One at first, then 10, then hundreds. And then you realize there's no end. The stakes stretch for miles in every direction. Contemporary accounts suggest the field of impaled bodies extended for nearly 2 miles and lengthened half a mile in width. Some sources claim there were 10,000 bodies. Others say as many as 20,000. The truth is likely somewhere in between 15,000 to 20,000 impaled bodies. But what's most chilling is this: it wasn't random. The stakes were arranged in precise geometric patterns. Circles, stars, and concentric rings, all radiating out from the capital. Vlad had spent weeks preparing this spectacle, possibly even months. He had captured Ottoman soldiers and sympathizers from previous skirmishes. Some of the bodies had been dead for weeks, rotting in the summer heat, while others had only just been impaled, and some, according to multiple sources, were still alive. The Byzantine chronicler Leon Ekis Chalkokondals, who interviewed eyewitnesses, reported that the moans of the dying could be heard across the entire field. Even the hardened Ottoman troops, who had conquered entire cities and slaughtered thousands, were unnerved. Some reportedly began to vomit. Others refused to march forward, as some even deserted in the night, willing to risk execution rather than face what they had seen. And at the center of it all, on the highest stake, was Hamza Pasha, an Ottoman commander who had been captured in an earlier skirmish. His body was positioned directly in front of the route Mehmed's army would take. This was Vlad's personal message to the Sultan: "This is what I do to your best men. Imagine what it'll do to you." When Mehmed saw this, the Sultan, who had watched Constantinople fall to his cannons and who had orchestrated countless executions, stopped his horse and stared in stunned silence. The exact words of his response differ between sources, but one version, recorded by Chalkokondals, is widely accepted. It is not possible to deprive of his country a man who has done such great deeds, who knows how to use his power so effectively. A man who has done such things is worth much. This was praise. It was acknowledgement. The Sultan realized that he was facing something he didn't fully understand, a mind that had taken the Ottoman methods of terror and elevated them to an entirely new, more terrifying level. The military situation for the Ottomans was unraveling. Supply lines had stretched too thin. The scorched earth tactics had taken their toll. The night raids had eroded morale. Sultan Mehmed's commanders began advising him to retreat. But then came the final blow: the forest of the Impaled. It was just a battlefield was. It was psychological warfare at its peak. Vlad was trying to win a conventional battle. He was trying to destroy the will to fight. And it worked. Within days, Sultan Mehmed ordered a full retreat. The Ottoman army, the most powerful military force in the world, had been turned back by a much smaller, outnumbered enemy, not through military might, but through sheer terror. But Vlad's triumph was short-lived, and what followed was the ultimate tragedy. You'd think that repelling the Ottoman Empire would have made Vlad a hero in Christian Europe. In some ways it did. The Hungarian king and even the Pope praised his defense of Christendom. But they failed to understand something crucial about Vlad. The methods that had repelled the Ottomans didn't stop with them. He used those same methods on everyone. By late 1462, Vlad was impaling Wallachia and merchants for charging high prices. He impaled boyars suspected of disloyalty based on rumors. He impaled entire villages for minor infractions. The very tactics that had once been a weapon against a greater enemy had become his go-to method for every problem, every perceived threat. His political situation quickly deteriorated. His brother Radu, now supported by Ottoman money and troops, positioned himself as the more reasonable alternative to Vlad. Meanwhile, Hungarian support evaporated as Vlad's increasingly erratic behavior alienated his allies. By November of 1462, just months after his greatest victory, Vlad was forced to flee into Hungary. And here's the bitter irony: he was imprisoned by his supposed ally, King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary. The reasons for his imprisonment are murky. Some sources claim that Matthias fabricated evidence, making it seem like Vlad had been negotiating with the Ottomans. Others suggest that Vlad had become such a liability, even to his Christian allies, that they simply wanted him out of the way. For the next 12 years, Vlad lived in captivity. Not the brutal, tortuous imprisonment of his youth, but house arrest in comfortable quarters. He even married a Hungarian noblewoman and had children. By all accounts, he was a model prisoner. But in 1476, an opportunity came. Wallachia had descended into chaos under a series of weak rulers, and Vlad's old allies, including the Prince of Moldavia, Stephen the Great, helped orchestrate his return to the throne. Vlad reclaimed his throne in November of 1476, but he had only 2 months to rule before he met his end. In December 1476 or January 1477, the exact date is unclear, Vlad was killed in battle against an Ottoman force near Bucharest. The circumstances of his death are shrouded in mystery. Some accounts suggest he was betrayed and killed by his own men, either by accident or out of treachery. Others say he was overwhelmed by Ottoman forces. What is certain is what happened next: his head was severed, preserved in honey, and sent to Sultan Mehmed in Constantinople as proof of his death. After all that terror, all that bloodshed, Vlad ended up as a trophy, a macabre symbol for mockery displayed in the very empire he had fought his entire life. His body was allegedly buried at the St. Agave monastery on an island in Romania. Excavations conducted in the 1932 found a tomb there, but it was empty. To this day, no one knows where Vlad's true remains rest. So what do we do with this story? In Romania, Vlad is often celebrated as a national hero, a brutal but effective leader who stood against overwhelming odds to preserve his country's independence. Statues of him stand proudly in various places and his image appears on tourist merchandise. But to the rest of the world, especially after Bram Stoker's 1897 novel Dracula loosely borrowed his name in history, Vlad became synonymous with vampirism and supernatural evil. In a way, this lets us off the hook. It's easier to think of him as a monster, something inhuman, rather than confronting the real horror. Because the real horror is this: everything Vlad did was deeply, painfully human. He was born a monster. He was shaped by the system he was raised in, a system that taught him that power comes through terror, that survival requires ruthlessness, and that empathy is weakness. He took those lessons and refined them to their darkest extreme. The forest of the Impaled was just madness. It was the calculated application of psychological warfare. The night raids weren't just random violence, they were strategic military tactics. Every impalement, every mutilation, every public display of suffering was part of a larger, deliberate plan. And here's the scariest part: it worked. Against impossible odds, using nothing but calculated fear, Vlad turned back an empire. He proved that fear, when wielded properly, could achieve what armies couldn't. The question isn't whether Vlad was evil, that's obvious. The question is, what does it say about human nature that this method of terror was so effective? And what are the calculated horrors from history's shadows are waiting to teach us lessons we'd rather not learn? If you want to keep uncovering the uncomfortable truths that textbooks bury, subscribe. Because history's darkest chapters aren't just about what happened, they're about understanding why it worked. And that's the knowledge we can't afford to forget.